The story of Albert Anastasia does not begin with the roar of gunfire, nor with the cold-blooded efficiency that would one day make his name echo across the American underworld. It begins across an ocean, in the gentle hush of coastal Italy, where the waves rolled against the shores of Calabria and dreams were small, fragile things carried only as far as hunger allowed. Albert was born Umberto Anastasio in 1902 in the tiny port town of Tropea. It was a place where fishermen lived by the tides, where poverty ran deeper than the sea, and where children grew up with work-hardened hands long before they learned to read. The Anastasio family had little, but what they did have was survival. Survival in the look of a father who labored without rest. Survival in the eyes of a mother who could stretch a loaf of bread across several meals. Survival in the 6 brothers who shared one room and lived by the simple rule: protect one another or be swallowed by the world. From the start, Albert was different from the others. He was quiet, observant, almost unnervingly calm for a child. He didn't cry when he fell. He didn't argue like the other boys. Instead, he watched, studying people with a stillness that made grown men shift uncomfortably beneath his gaze. Some said he had a storm inside him. Some said he was born with iron instead of fear. But the truth was simpler. Albert understood the world early, that life took from you unless you took first. When he was barely a teenager, Italy's hardships overwhelmed the family. America, the fabled land of opportunity, became the dream that might lift them out of hunger. One by one, the Anastasio brothers crossed the ocean, slipping into the flow of immigrants pouring into New York City. Albert arrived in 1919, at age 17, stepping onto American soil with nothing but a name, a stubborn heart, and a willingness to do whatever the world required to survive. He found work the way most poor immigrants did, at the docks. The New York waterfront was a universe of brute strength, shouting foremen, and hard men whose knuckles did most of the talking. Albert fit in as if he had been carved for that world. His body hardened quickly from hauling cargo, and the longshoremen learned that the quiet kid with the dark stare was someone you didn't cross lightly. But the docks were controlled by more than muscle. They were ruled by unions, racketeers, and shadowy figures who came down to the piers only when money or blood needed to move. And it was there, among the ropes, crates, and salt-bitten air, that Albert Anastasia stepped into the world that would define him. It happened with a fight, a simple dispute, a foreman accusing him of working too slowly, shoving him with the back of his hand. The kind of moment most men would swallow to keep their job. But Albert was not most men. In a flash, he struck back. A single vicious blow that sent the foreman crashing into a steel railing. The man died within the hour. Albert was arrested, charged with murder, and thrown into a cell where most young immigrants would have broken under the weight of fear. Albert didn't. Guards would later recall the unnerving calm he carried. A teenager sitting in a dimly lit cell, hands folded, eyes steady, as though he had already accepted whatever fate the world laid before him. Something in that stillness caught the attention of the wrong and, perhaps for Albert, the right people. His case mysteriously collapsed. Witnesses evaporated. Evidence fell apart. And Albert Anastasia walked out of prison a free man, but no longer an unknown. Men from the Italian underworld, scouts for future legends like Lucky Luciano, had noticed him, not just for the violence, but for the frightening calm inside it. They saw the potential for a soldier, a loyal hand, a future enforcer. This young longshoreman who killed without hesitation had earned their attention and their interest. Soon, Albert was no longer hauling crates. He was hauling envelopes, messages, and eventually orders. The transformation was slow, deliberate, and unnervingly natural. He learned discipline. He learned loyalty. And he learned the rules of a world where silence was the highest virtue and honor was measured in blood. He was drawn into the orbit of Giuseppe, Joe the Boss Masuria, the reigning ruler of New York's criminal empire. Albert became a dependable enforcer, valued for his cold clarity under pressure. But the underworld was shifting. A younger, sharper generation, men like Luciano, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese were rising. They aimed to reshape the Mafia from the chaotic old world feuds into a modern, organized syndicate. And in that shifting, dangerous time, Albert Anastasia found his calling. They would call him many names over the years: the High Lord Executioner, the Mad Hatter, the head of Murder Inc. But before all that, he was simply a quiet immigrant kid who refused to bow to anyone. And the Mafia noticed. By the late 1920s, the streets of New York trembled with tension. Masuria's grip was slipping, the Castellamarese faction was rising, and the bloodiest Mafia conflict in American history, the Castellamarese War, was beginning. Albert stood at a crossroads he didn't choose, yet one he embraced with chilling confidence. This quiet young man from Calabria was about to become a central weapon in a war that would reshape organized crime forever. And the calm, atmospheric shadows of New York were about to echo with his name: Albert Anastasia, the man whose silence was deadlier than any shout, the man who would one day rule the most feared killing machine the mob had ever created. Tonight, we begin his story. New York in the late 1920s did not sleep. Not truly. It tossed and turned like a restless giant, lit by the neon glow of clubs, the crackle of backroom deals, and the sharp whisper of footsteps in alleyways that led to places polite society pretended didn't exist. This was the New York Albert Anastasia grew into, a city balancing between two eras: the old world of Sicilian bosses and the new world of American-born visionaries. And Albert, as quiet as he was deadly, became one of the blades that would carve the future. The Mafia was tearing itself apart. Two powerful factions emerged: Joe the Boss Masuria, who favored the old ways; Salvatore Maranzano, who envisioned a Roman-like hierarchy. The war that followed would stain New York with fear, suspicion, and bodies that vanished into rivers or were found slumped behind steering wheels, their fate sealed by the click of a single decision. Albert Anastasia didn't choose a side. A side chose him. Masuria needed a man who didn't hesitate, a man whose nerves didn't shake, whose breathing stayed even, whose loyalty was unquestioned. He chose Albert. Albert didn't raise his voice. He didn't boast. He simply did the work, quietly, efficiently, coldly. And in a world where ruthlessness often trumped strategy, Albert earned a reputation. When Anastasia was sent, the job was already done. But while he served Masuria, he watched the movements of younger men rising in the Mafia. Lucky Luciano, charismatic, brilliant, and impossibly ambitious. Frank Costello, the diplomat, a man whose mind worked faster than any gun. Vito Genovese, unpredictable, powerful, and hungry. Meyer Lansky, a Jewish mastermind and financier. Bugsy Siegel, fiery, loyal, and dangerously fearless. These men weren't tied to old Sicilian traditions. They saw the future in dollars, not family feuds. And Albert, despite being an old-world immigrant himself, was drawn to this new wave. It was their courage to reshape the entire underworld that resonated with him. Their ideas ran deeper than bullets. Their vision was larger than one city. And in time, Albert Anastasia would help make it real. One evening, in a dimly lit back room of a Brooklyn club, Luciano called Albert in for a quiet conversation. Frank Costello stood nearby, his calm voice and cigarette smoke creating a haze of steady control. Luciano leaned forward. "Albert, the old world is dying, and we don't survive unless we choose the future." Albert's eyes held the same unbroken stillness they always had. Luciano continued, "Masuria's way keeps us in chains. The money is in unity, not war. But we need people who can help clear the path." Albert understood immediately. There was no need to say the word. He knew what path clearing meant. And so did Luciano. "And we'll remember everyone who stood with us?" Lucky added softly. Albert nodded once. A simple movement, quiet like everything he did. But in that moment, he chose a side. Not with his voice, but with the unspoken vow behind his eyes. He would help forge the new American Mafia. The turning point came in 1931. Masuria, paranoid and slipping, sought loyalty through fear, not respect. He demanded obedience, not partnership. And his own soldiers, the ones he trusted most, were preparing to end his reign. Albert was among them. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Luciano invited Masuria to a quiet lunch at a Coney Island restaurant. Luciano excused himself to the bathroom, and in the eerie stillness that followed, four hitmen stormed the room. Vito Genovese, Bugsy Siegel, Joe Adonis, and Albert Anastasia. The shots were quick, precise, final. Masuria slumped over the table, cards scattering from his lifeless hand. Albert's face remained still. No anger, no joy, just the cold, patient expression of a man who accepted the world for what it was. This moment ended the Castellamarese War and began the Luciano era. But it also elevated Albert into something more than an enforcer. He was now a trusted executor, a silent partner in shaping the new order. With Masuria gone and Maranzano soon falling to Luciano's men as well, the Mafia reorganized into the Commission, a national governing body. And with order came a new need: enforcement, not chaotic, messy street killings, but a centralized system that handled business with precision, secrecy, and consistency. So the underworld created something unprecedented: Murder Incorporated, a national network of contract killers working for the Commission. And at its heart, its iron core, its silent commander, was Albert Anastasia. He shared control with the Jewish mobsters Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, but the muscle, the discipline, the fear, that belonged to Albert. Witnesses would later describe him as eerily calm even moments before violence. A man who didn't shout orders, he whispered them. Under him, Murder Incorporated became a phantom organization, a ghostly force, a shadow that terrified gangsters more than the police. If your name made it onto their list, you didn't see mourning. And yet, in the softest contradiction, Albert kept a strange kind of honor. He protected his men fiercely, spoke rarely, and often handled the most dangerous tasks himself. He believed that loyalty was sacred. He expected obedience, but he gave protection in return. And in that brutal world, many considered him fair, in his own chilling way. By the late 1930s, Albert Anastasia was no longer a dock worker. He was a king without a crown, a ruler of shadows. A man feared not for rage, but for his absolute silent certainty. Stories about him multiplied. Some said he could walk into a room full of armed men and leave without a wrinkle on his shirt. Some claimed he never missed a shot. Others swore he didn't blink during killings, that he carried out orders with a detached calm that made even hardened gangsters uneasy. The press began calling him the Mad Hatter, a name born from his unpredictability, or rather, the unpredictability others projected onto him. Albert wasn't reckless. He wasn't wild. He was efficient, and his efficiency made him legendary. But legends attract light, and light makes shadows dangerous. The quiet rise of Albert Anastasia was complete. Now came the years where power sharpened, alliances shifted, and betrayal lurked behind smiles. The years where Albert would take command of his destiny and face the consequences that came with being too feared and too powerful. The 1940s drifted in like a slow tide, and with them came a new phase of Albert Anastasia's life, one drenched in quiet authority, violent precision, and the calm confidence of a man who had mastered the darkest parts of the American underworld. By this time, the young dockside killer from Calabria was gone. In his place stood a man who spoke softly, smiled rarely, and carried a presence that chilled even the toughest hitmen. Anastasia was now a central pillar of the underworld, a name whispered in safe houses, bars, and police precincts with equal fear. And behind that reputation lay Murder Inc. The Brooklyn-based enforcement arm of the Mafia was unlike anything the United States had ever seen. It operated in silence. It answered to no precinct. Its members were ghosts in the streetlight's glow, and Albert Anastasia was their commander. The orders were simple: keep the Commission's will intact. Remove anyone who threatens business. No questions. No hesitation. Under Anastasia's leadership, the group carried out hits with the cold professionalism of a military unit. And Albert, with his controlled temper and frightening discipline, became the invisible hand that shaped mob justice across the United States. To most gangsters, he was not just a boss, he was the final word. A man whose nod determined life or death. But there was a contradiction in Anastasia, something that few men could understand. By day, he was calm, quiet, polished. He enjoyed tailored suits, long drives, and moments of silence that made others uneasy. But there was another side, one that earned him his infamous nickname, the Mad Hatter. A side that exploded without warning. A side that could turn a quiet meeting into a storm of rage. A side that made even seasoned mobsters step back and raise their hands in caution. His temper, when triggered, was not loud, it was lethal. A sudden shift in his eyes, a movement of the jaw, a whisper instead of a shout, and then action. This combination of icy control and unpredictable fury made him as terrifying as he was respected. As Murder Incorporated grew stronger, so did Anastasia's influence. He became the bridge between lawless streets and the Mafia's secret commission. Every boss owed him something, a favor, a quiet debt, or a life spared. But power in the underworld comes at a price. Men began to fear that Anastasia's authority was growing too fast, too wide, too unchallenged. Even within his own circles, whispers began to rise. What if Anastasia wants more than enforcement? What if he aims to take over everything? What if he's becoming too dangerous to control? In the Mafia, power breeds paranoia, and paranoia breeds betrayal. The betrayal of the underworld. By the late 1940s, the landscape of organized crime was shifting. New money, new alliances, new men hungry for power. Some believed Anastasia's loyalty stood with the Mafia's traditions. Others feared he was too independent, too uncontrollable. Behind the scenes, a quiet storm began to gather. Meetings were held without him. Decisions were made in shadows. The commission watched him with careful eyes. Because the truth was simple. Albert Anastasia held too much power, too much fear, and too many secrets. And in the Mafia, that made him a threat to everyone. By the early 1950s, the world of organized crime was changing again. Shifting like old wood under pressure, cracking in places where no one expected. But one thing remained solid: Albert Anastasia's empire. He had risen beyond Murder Incorporated, beyond the docks, beyond the role of enforcer. Now, he stood at the top of the underworld pyramid. Albert Anastasia, boss of the most powerful family in America. The Gambino family, though it wouldn't be called that yet, was his to command. And for a time, the streets bent to his will. But power, especially in the Mafia, is not a crown. It is a weight, heavy, cold, and usually temporary. When boss Vincent Mangano disappeared, a disappearance no one questioned too loudly, Anastasia stepped into the vacuum with the support of Carlo Gambino and other quiet allies. He presented himself to the commission not as a usurper, but as the only man capable of restoring order. And surprisingly, the commission agreed. Perhaps they feared him, perhaps they respected him, or perhaps they understood that unstable times required a man who could make hard decisions without blinking. Under Anastasia, the family grew richer. Gambling, unions, construction, everything flowed smoothly, efficiently. But beneath the surface, trouble brewed, because not everyone believed he deserved the throne.
Carlo Gambino, quiet, clever, calculating, watched Anastasia closely.
Where Anastasia ruled with force, Gambino preferred patience. Where Anastasia used fear, Gambino used strategy. Their partnership was uneasy. Their ambitions, even more so. Men whispered in backrooms, "Gambino is biding his time. Anastasia doesn't see what's coming. He's too focused on control to see the knife in the shadows." And in the Mafia, shadows are always full of knives. Albert Anastasia's downfall didn't begin with a bullet. It began with television. When a Brooklyn barber named Arnold Schuster helped the police catch a fugitive, Anastasia reportedly became enraged at the sight of the man on TV. He despised informers, even when they had nothing to do with the Mafia. His rage got the better of him. He supposedly ordered Schuster killed. The murder was brutal and unnecessary, and worst of all, it brought enormous heat on the mob. Suddenly, Anastasia wasn't just feared. He was considered reckless. Carlo Gambino saw his opportunity, A man who cannot control his temper cannot control a family. And slowly, quietly, a plan began to form. Betrayal in bright light. The commission decided something unthinkable. Albert Anastasia, the Mad Hatter, the executioner, the man who built Murder Incorporated, had to be removed. Not demoted, not exiled, removed. The vote was unanimous. The execution approved. Anastasia, who had once held the power of life and death over hundreds of men, now had a silent death sentence hanging over his own head. The irony was chilling, but in the Mafia, fate is often poetic and brutal. The days leading to his death were calm. He visited his usual spots. He trusted the wrong people. He drifted through New York in quiet confidence, unaware that the world around him had already decided his fate. Even the men closest to him, men he fed, protected, and raised through the ranks, now spoke in whispered agreements, planning the final chapter of a kingpin. Albert Anastasia was walking into the last sunrise of his life, and he didn't even know it. The morning of October 25th, 1957 began like any other for Albert Anastasia. A crisp autumn chill hung in the air. Manhattan was waking up slowly, the way only New York could. Horns distant, footsteps rhythmic, coffee shops glowing with warm light. In the heart of the city, inside the lobby of the Park Sheraton Hotel, a small barbershop opened its doors. It was quiet, familiar, comforting, a place Anastasia visited often. To him, it was a safe space. To his enemies, it was the perfect stage. Albert walked inside with the confidence of a man who believed fear still protected him. He nodded to the barber, removed his jacket, and sat in the large chair near the mirrors, the one he always preferred. He closed his eyes as the barber wrapped a warm towel around his face. For a moment, everything was calm. The hum of clippers, the soft shuffle of shoes, the quiet rhythm of a city still stretching awake. But behind that peaceful room, something cold pressed forward. Two men moved silently through the hotel corridor.
No hesitation.
No fear, their faces hidden by scarves. This was not improvisation. This was not anger. This was a sanctioned execution, approved by the commission, organized by Gambino, and carried out by professionals. The age of Anastasia was ending, and it would end here. The door opened. The two gunmen entered fast, moving like shadows. The barber stepped back. The entire room froze except for the killers. Anastasia opened his eyes. For a split second, he looked into the mirror and saw death coming. He tried to rise, pure instinct, pure survival. But the shaving cape wrapped around him held him down. Gunfire erupted, loud, sharp, echoing off tiled walls. Bullets tore through the air in rapid bursts. Anastasia lunged forward, blinded by panic, reaching for his attackers. But the room was filled with reflections. Mirrors everywhere, split images, distorted movements. Dying, he fought his own reflection. It was tragic. It was poetic. It was the final, fatal confusion of a man who once controlled life and death. Seconds later, the gunmen were gone, and Albert Anastasia, the executioner, the Mad Hatter, the boss of Murder Incorporated, lay bleeding on the barbershop floor. He died in the very environment he once ruled with absolute terror. The Mafia did not mourn him, not publicly, not privately. Within hours, the underworld moved on. Gambino quietly took over the family. A move so smooth, so carefully orchestrated, it seemed inevitable. The newspapers exploded with headlines. Citizens whispered about the barbershop murder. Law enforcement scrambled. But the mob world remained calm, collected, and strangely relieved. To them, Anastasia's death was not a tragedy. It was maintenance, a necessary shift in power. Despite his violent end, Albert Anastasia left behind a legacy carved into the stone of American crime history. He was one of the last true Old World enforcers. A man who built power with fear, loyalty, and blood. A man who treated violence not as a tool, but as an art. He shaped Murder Inc. He shaped the docks. He shaped the early structure of the Mafia itself. But ultimately, he became a victim of the very world he helped create. a world where loyalty was temporary, and power was always rented, never owned. And so, in the quiet hours of the night, his story becomes more than violence. It becomes a lesson. Even giants fall. Even kings are replaceable. Even the executioner meets his executioner. And in the dim glow of a barbershop mirror, Albert Anastasia's reflection still lingers, part myth, part warning, part tragedy.